Imagine standing in your own front yard, just watching the sun go down.
Right, just a normal evening.
Yeah. Your wife is next to you, your kids are playing in the driveway, and a police cruiser pulls up.
Okay, that's already stressful.
Right. Two officers get out, they walk straight past your kids, and they just put you in handcuffs.
Wow.
You ask what's going on, obviously, and one of them holds up a piece of paper. It's this blurry, grainy printout of a man stealing watches from a store on the completely other side of the city.
Mm-hmm.
You look at the photo and you tell them, that is not me. The officer looks at the paper, looks at you and says, well, the computer says it is.
God, that actually happened to Robert Williams, didn't it, in Detroit?
Exactly. A completely innocent man arrested just because a facial recognition algorithm generated a false match.
It's so unsettling.
It is, because the police had the physical flesh and blood human being standing right in front of them. I mean, a man who clearly did not match the photo, but they trusted the machine's simulation of reality more than their own eyes.
Right, the algorithm completely overrode physical reality.
Yeah, and that single incident, it's kind of the terminal point of this huge stack of documents sitting on the table between us today.
It really is. It's a terrifying paradigm shift. I mean, the simulation becomes the authority.
Right.
The map becomes more important than the actual territory.
Yeah, and usually for a deep dive, we're looking at a single biography or breaking down one new piece of tech. But these sources, man, trying to process all of this over the last few days has been profoundly unsettling.
I completely agree. It is a genuinely disturbing collection of material, mostly because of how disconnected the sources seem at first glance, right?
Yeah.
Until you start to see the through line.
Yeah, let's map out what we're actually looking at here for the listener. We've got declassified NATO military reports on cognitive warfare.
Right.
We've got psychological studies from the 1970s all the way to last year on something called the illusory truth effect.
Which is fascinating.
Then there's corporate whistleblower testimonies from the highest levels of Silicon Valley. And sitting right in the center, acting as this bizarre skeleton key for the rest of it, is a dense work of 1980s French philosophy by Jean Baudrillard.
It's quite a stack, but when you synthesize these documents, I mean, the military doctrine, the behavioral psychology, the whistleblower data, they all point to the exact same phenomenon.
The systematic dismantling of objective reality.
Exactly. What we are exploring here is the architecture of how algorithms, mass surveillance, and state fear tactics are literally programming public perception and human behavior.
And the craziest part is they're doing it entirely beneath the threshold of conscious awareness.
Yeah. It's happening to you sitting there listening to this right now.
Your mind, your actual physical brain, the neurons firing in your head, the way you perceive the world, it's the primary contested battle space.
It's the most valuable resource on Earth. Your attention, your fears, your perception of what is true, those are commodities now.
So to understand how this machinery works, we can't really start with code or algorithms, can we?
No. We have to start with biology. Before any system can manipulate a human being, it needs to render that human being vulnerable.
Right.
It needs to bypass those analytical defenses. And the most efficient way to bypass rational thought is through fear.
Fear is literally an evolutionary override.
Exactly. Think about how the human brain is structured. When you experience a high arousal state of intense fear, the amygdala, the primitive reptilian part of your brain, it hijacks your central nervous system.
It just takes over.
Yeah, it literally reroutes the electrical signals in your brain away from the prefrontal cortex.
And the prefrontal cortex, that's where we do our rationalizing, right? Our risk assessment, complex problem solving, all that.
Right. That entire system just goes dark. I mean, evolutionarily, if a tiger is jumping out of the bushes, you don't have time to conduct a statistical risk assessment on the velocity of the tiger.
You just need to run.
You just run. It's a brilliant survival mechanism. But the vulnerability arises when that biological override is intentionally triggered as a tool for governance or compliance.
Which brings us to a really specific document from the early 2020s. This is the UK's Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behavior.
Right, they go by FPIB.
Yeah, SPIB.
Yeah.
And look, I want to be incredibly clear here. To you listening, we are looking at this strictly through an analytical lens. We are just analyzing the behavioral science playbook here, completely removing any political endorsement or condemnation of the actual public health policies.
Right, we're just looking at the psychological mechanisms they describe.
Exactly, because those mechanisms are staggering. They were evaluating public compliance with lockdown measures, and the behavioral scientists wrote this actual sentence. A substantial number of people still do not feel sufficiently personally threatened.
Just pause and really consider the implication of that.
Yeah.
A government behavioral science unit viewing a lack of fear as a problem that inherently needs to be solved.
Right, because if you have a healthy young person who is looking at demographic mortality data, calmly assessing their own statistical vulnerability, and feeling relatively reassured.
That rational assessment was not viewed as a public health victory.
No, it was viewed as an obstacle to compliance.
Because a calm, rational populace evaluating their own localized risk will inevitably make highly individualized choices. Some will stay home, some will go out.
But if the goal is absolute, uniform compliance across an entire population, you can't rely on individual risk assessment.
No, you have to deploy what researchers call the democratization of risk.
The democratization of risk, meaning you have to make everyone feel equally in danger, regardless of the objective physical reality of their actual statistical vulnerability.
And we basically have to level the psychological playing field through trauma.
And the sources detail how this was achieved through the Look Into My Eyes campaign.
Oh, that was intense.
They used extreme, visceral, high-arousal imagery. Patients in oxygen masks, struggling to breathe, staring directly into the camera lens.
The cinematography was explicitly designed to mimic horror films, right?
Yeah, the lighting, the pacing, the immediate visual confrontation. The goal was to elevate that perceived level of personal threat across the entire board, intentionally triggering that exact amygdala hijack we just talked about.
It is a really precise clinical application of the fear drive theory.
I spent hours going over Yannis's 1967 research on this. Yannis mapped out how fear interacts with persuasion, and it's not a straight line, which is fascinating.
No, it's an inverted U-shaped curve.
Exactly. So picture a bell curve for a second. If a message uses too little fear, like the far left side of the curve, people are complacent. They glance at the public health warning and just go about their day.
Right, it doesn't register.
But if the message uses too much fear, you slide down the far right side of the curve. People experience defensive denial.
The terror just becomes paralyzing.
Yeah, so the brain protects itself by shutting down entirely. They adopt unrealistic optimism, essentially telling themselves, this is too terrifying to process, so I'm just going to pretend it isn't real.
So the sweet spot for absolute compliance is the exact apex of that inverted U. The behavioral scientists were constantly tuning the imagery and the messaging to hit the absolute peak of that curve.
The precise optimal dose of terror to ensure total obedience without tipping the population into defensive denial.
And the emotional fallout of that is devastating. Because to make the democratization of risk work, to maintain that peak level of fear, you have to alter how human beings perceive one another.
You have to turn fellow citizens into biohazards.
You have to dismantle the social fabric. The sources document the deliberate creation of outgroups to achieve this.
Media campaigns popularizing terms like COVIDiots to create a scapegoat class.
And the induction of profound guilt-driven compliance. When official messaging targets children and teenagers with slogans like, "Don't kill Granny," I mean, you are taking the agonizing moral weight of life and death and placing it squarely on everyday, mundane social interactions.
You are weaponizing a child's natural empathy against them. But let me push back on this for a second, though. Looking at the context of the time, I mean, hospitals are overflowing. We were facing a novel pathogen. Couldn't you argue this was simply a desperately overwhelmed public health apparatus doing whatever it took to prevent a catastrophic collapse of the medical system rather than some calculated, malicious manipulation of reality?
It's a fair question, but the intent behind the policy, whether it was a desperate, benevolent attempt to save lives or a cynical exercise in control, it doesn't actually change the underlying psychological mechanism.
Right.
That's what the research emphasizes. The mechanism relies on systematically dismantling a population's ability to rationally orient themselves to reality. It deliberately induces a state of chronic emotional vulnerability.
And when a population is living in chronic fear, their behavior changes entirely.
They develop a profound psychological dependency on the exact entity that is dictating the rules for safety. In clinical psychology, this mirrors the mechanics of traumatic bonding. The environment terrifies you, your amygdala is screaming, and the system offers you the only available path to psychological relief, which is absolute compliance.
Traumatic bonding on a societal macro level.
Yes. It creates a population that is primed, exhausted, and desperately looking for a cohesive narrative to make the fear stop. Fear is the biological primer. It softens the ground.
But once the mind is made vulnerable, like, how does a system go about installing a completely new manufactured reality.
You certainly don't do it with a carefully constructed logical argument.
No, you do it with overwhelming repetition. You use a fire hose.
Right, so we move from the biology of fear into the cognitive psychology of belief.
There's a fascinating study in our stack by Hassan and Barber on a phenomenon called the illusory truth effect. The original concept dates back to 1977, but the recent data they've compiled is staggering.
What did they find?
The illusory truth effect demonstrates that merely repeating a claim, even if that claim is completely false, even if it contradicts prior knowledge, even if it is highly implausible, it measurably increases a person's belief that it's true.
It feels incredibly counterintuitive, doesn't it? We like to believe our minds are sophisticated lie detectors. The idea that you can just repeat a lie until it magically transforms into truth sounds almost too simplistic to be effective.
Right, but the neuroscience backs it up, and the mathematical progression of the effect is terrifying. Hassan and Barber found that the increase in belief doesn't happen linearly, it happens logarithmically.
Which means the first few repetitions are the most dangerous.
Exactly. The absolute largest leap in your brain's willingness to believe a falsehood happens the very second time you hear it.
Like, really? The second time?
The jump from hearing it once to hearing it twice is the most critical vulnerability point. From there, the belief incrementally increases with each repetition, peaking at about 9 repetitions, before the brain starts to experience wear out and the effect plateaus.
So this specific cognitive vulnerability is the engine behind the Rand Corporation's model of the firehose of falsehood.
Yes.
Rand initially observed this strategy in Russian state propaganda, but it maps perfectly onto modern algorithmic media and domestic political ecosystems.
The firehose strategy is built on 4 pillars. It is high volume, it is multi-channel, it is rapid and continuous, and this is the most important part. It possesses absolutely zero commitment to objective reality or consistency.
That lack of consistency is what shatters traditional communication theory.
How so?
Well, normally if someone is trying to persuade you, consistency is their most valuable asset. If they contradict themselves, they lose all credibility.
But the firehose model operates on a totally different physical law. The contradiction simply doesn't matter. The volume is the weapon.
Right, quantity literally has a quality of its own.
The objective isn't to build a sturdy, logical argument that holds up to scrutiny. The objective is to entirely consume the target's cognitive bandwidth.
Because think about the physical toll of information overload. The modern human brain is bombarded with thousands of data points a day. Evaluating a claim critically, like stopping, accessing your prior knowledge, comparing the new information, checking the source that costs the brain calories, it requires significant cognitive energy.
And your brain is constantly trying to save energy.
Exactly. So it takes a shortcut. It relies on a heuristic called processing fluency.
Processing fluency, meaning the easier something is to process, the more accurate it feels.
Right. If you've heard a phrase multiple times across different channels, the neural pathways associated with that phrase are primed. When you hear it again, the brain processes it with extreme cognitive ease.
And here is the fatal flaw in human cognition, right? The brain misinterprets that feeling of cognitive ease as evidence of truth.
If it feels familiar, it feels true.
The familiarity bypasses the logic center entirely. And it's compounded by what psychologists call the sleeper effect.
Oh, the sleeper effect is wild.
Yet over time, your memory actually decouples the information from its source. You might initially read a completely fabricated headline on a shady anonymous forum. In the moment, you might even think, well, this looks fake.
Right, you dismiss it.
But a month later, the memory of the shady forum has faded. The source is forgotten. But the falsehood itself remains stored in your brain as a familiar, easily processed piece of data.
The falsehood just graduates into a fact.
We actually have a visceral clinical example of this in the sources from the Sinclair broadcast group. This happened several years ago, and it is still deeply unsettling to watch.
Oh, I remember this.
Nearly 200 local television anchors across the United States were mandated by corporate management to read the exact same scripted warning about the dangers of fake news.
The compilation videos of that broadcast are pure dystopian surrealism.
It's crazy. Someone took dozens of these local broadcasts and edited them together. You have these trusted, familiar, smiling faces in different cities, sitting at different news desks, all speaking in this robotic, synchronized lockstep.
They are reciting a centralized corporate narrative that was carefully disguised as local independent journalism.
That is the multi-channel aspect of the firehose in action. When you hear the identical phrase repeated across multiple independent channels, channels that you previously trusted as separate entities, Your processing fluency simply surrenders.
The brain just says, well, if everyone is saying this exact same sequence of words, it must be the underlying reality.
And I want to point out, imparting no political bias here, the academic research points out clinical examples of this repetition shaping reality across the entire ideological spectrum.
Absolutely.
The studies highlight the 2016 Trump campaign's repeated claims about the border wall being actively under construction, long before ground was ever broken. The repetition created a reality for his supporters that superseded the physical truth.
Or the long-running Obama birther conspiracy. It persisted for years, thriving entirely on repetition despite the existence of absolute documentary proof to the contrary. The physical document of the birth certificate was powerless against the processing fluency of the repeated rumor.
Or look at the stark divergence in reality during the early days of the pandemic. Researchers tracked viewers of Sean Hannity versus viewers of Tucker Carlson.
This is a crazy stat.
Right. Based purely on the slightly different repeated narratives and framing regarding the severity of the virus on those two specific shows, the audiences literally exhibited different real-world behavioral outcomes, which translated into different mortality rates.
The repeated narrative didn't just change their opinions. It changed how they interacted with physical reality, which ultimately determined whether they lived or died.
The human brain simply cannot withstand a continuous multi-channel fire hose. Eventually, the sheer volume of the water erodes the rock. Objective reality is washed away.
But the fire hose, as devastating as it is, has a limitation, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a blunt instrument. Spraying massive volumes of water everywhere is inefficient. Some people will naturally tune it out.
Right, because it's broadcasting. You're hitting everyone with the same hose.
So what if the system didn't have to guess?
What if the system knew precisely which specific, highly individualized fears would trigger your unique amygdala? What if the fire hose could be transformed into a laser, calibrated specifically to your personal psychological profile?
To do that, the system would need a comprehensive, real-time map of your entire life. It would need to know your habits, your secret desires, the things you pause to look at when you think nobody is watching.
It would require the extractive engine of surveillance capitalism.
We have extensive testimony here from Professor Shoshana Zuboff. She's the academic who essentially defined the field of surveillance capitalism, and she traces the genesis of this entire architecture back to a very specific, desperate moment in time, Google, in the year 2001.
Right after the dot-com bubble had just burst.
Exactly. Silicon Valley was hemorrhaging capital. Google had built this miraculously effective search engine, but they were facing financial ruin because investors were demanding a return, and Google had no idea how to monetize search queries.
In that environment of existential corporate panic, they started looking closely at their own servers. And they discovered something they had previously ignored.
Which was?
Every single time a user typed a query into the search bar, they left behind a microscopic trail of collateral data. Google called it data exhaust.
Data exhaust. Like the invisible carbon monoxide pouring out of a car's tailpipe.
Exactly. It wasn't just what you searched for, it was how quickly you typed it. Whether you used proper spelling or corrected a typo, what time of day you searched, where your IP address was located, what you clicked on next, and how long you lingered on that next page.
Initially, they just fed this exhaust back into the engine to improve the search results. But then the conceptual leap occurred. They realized that this collateral data contained profoundly accurate, predictive signals about human behavior.
Zuboff calls this the discovery of the behavioral surplus. They realized they could take human experience without asking, without compensating the user, turn that raw human experience into corporate property, and sell it in predictive commodity markets.
So you are no longer the customer. You aren't even really the product in the traditional sense.
You are the raw material being mined.
Your life is the extraction site. And it creates this deeply visceral feeling of being hunted for your psychological vulnerabilities.
Yeah, that's exactly what it feels like.
You are navigating the digital world, reading an article, watching a video, and these invisible systems are quietly sweeping up every micro-expression. Every time you hover your mouse over an image for a half-second too long, every time you pause scrolling, they are synthesizing that data into a high-fidelity voodoo doll of your psyche.
And that voodoo doll is then used to predict what you will feel, what you will desire, and what you will do next, so that advertisers can intercept your behavior before you even consciously make a decision.
What's truly terrifying is how this extraction has violently breached the digital realm and infected the physical world. Look at the telematics data in the documents regarding connected vehicles.
Oh, this was shocking.
If you drive a modern car, Take General Motors' OnStar system. For example, your car is secretly monitoring the physical physics of your driving.
It knows how hard you slam on the brakes, how aggressively you accelerate, your average speed on specific roads.
And GM was taking that physical data and sharing it with massive, opaque data brokers like LexisNexis and Verisk. Those brokers then calculate a risk score and sell it directly to your insurance company, resulting in massive rate hikes for drivers who had no idea their braking habits were being commodified.
The physical act of driving your car was converted into a behavioral surplus.
Or consider the expansion of facial recognition technology. The company Clearview AI scraped billions of photographs from public social media profiles entirely without consent to build an unauthorized global faceprint database.
Which brings us right back to the story of Robert Williams in Detroit.
Exactly. The algorithm scraped a flawed map of human faces, made a statistical guess, and the physical reality of a man's innocence was instantly erased by the machine's prediction.
We also see documents showing IBM utilizing unauthorized video footage from city cameras to build biometric sorting technology for the NYPD. Technology designed to literally scan and search for citizens walking down the physical street based on their skin color and hair color.
The physical world is being actively digitized into a searchable, trackable, predictive database.
But let me pause here because I can hear the counterargument forming from the listener. Hasn't marketing always done this? Hasn't advertising always tracked demographics?
Right, how is a data broker categorizing my driving habits fundamentally different from an advertising agency in the 1990s putting up a billboard for minivans in a wealthy suburban zip code to target soccer moms?
It is a fundamentally different species of manipulation. The evolutionary leap we have made is the shift from demographics to psychographics.
Demographics being who you are on paper.
Yes. Age, income, zip code. A billboard is a static guess based on broad averages. Surveillance capitalism doesn't care about your broad averages. It targets your real-time emotional state.
Which is where those Amazon patents come in, right?
Yeah.
Patents for facial recognition technology that explicitly aims to read whether a user is feeling afraid or happy or anxious in real time by analyzing their microexpressions through their device's camera.
Exactly. They aren't waiting for you to fit into a demographic cohort. They are actively waiting for the precise millisecond you're emotionally vulnerable, and then they inject a customized algorithmic stimulus precisely when your psychological defenses are at their absolute lowest.
So the architecture is fully operational. They have the biological vulnerability of your amygdala. They have the Firehose of repetition to install the narrative.
Yeah.
They have the surveillance apparatus to map your precise emotional state.
Now, how do they close the loop?
How do they use that massive psychological profile to actively control your behavior?
They trap you in the outrage economy.
We turn to the explosive whistleblower testimony of Frances Haugen, the former Facebook product manager who leaked the Facebook files. Her testimony provided an unprecedented look at the internal physics of algorithmic governance.
And the core quote that defines her testimony, a quote that should chill anyone who uses a smartphone is, "We built the machine, but we can't control the machine."
It is a confession of Frankenstein-level hubris.
It really is. The creators admitting that the algorithmic entity they unleashed has developed its own emergent behavior that supersedes human intent.
Haugen exposed the internal mathematical mechanics of engagement-based ranking, or EBR, specifically a metric they referred to as downstream engagement. The algorithm's prime directive is incredibly simple. Keep the human being glued to the screen for as many seconds as possible so they can be shown more advertisements.
The algorithm is an optimization engine. It constantly runs trillions of micro-experiments to figure out what captures human attention and what did the machine discover? What is the single most effective hook for the human nervous system?
Anger.
Anger.
The algorithm literally weighted an angry reaction emoji 5 times more heavily than a standard like. If a piece of content made people furious, the algorithm amplified this reach by a factor of 5.
Because anger is a high arousal fight or flight emotion. It loops right back to the amygdala hijack we started with.
Evolutionarily, if you perceive a threat, you cannot look away. You must monitor the threat.
The algorithm discovered that outraging a human being is the most efficient way to hold them hostage.
We saw this weaponized at a terrifying industrial scale during the Cambridge Analytica scandal. They illicitly harvested 87 million Facebook profiles to map out user-specific neuroticisms, biases, and fears using the Ocean personality model.
They took the shared public square, the physical and social space where citizens traditionally argue over the same baseline set of facts, and they shattered it.
They replaced it with an opaque, fragmented digital landscape where every single voter received a custom-built feed of their own highly personalized grievances.
It creates the ultimate epistemological isolation. You are sitting alone in a room staring at a screen thinking you are connected to the broader world, but you are actually trapped in a custom-built hall of mirrors meticulously designed to reflect your worst, most specific fears back at you in an endless loop.
There is brilliant research in our stack from Yale and Harvard breaking down the mechanics of this outrage economy. They tracked user behavior and found that moral outrage is twice as likely to be shared as neutral or positive content.
But it's worse than just sharing. The platforms utilize casino logic. They employ slot machine mechanics, specifically what behavioral psychologists call variable reinforcement schedules.
Like B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning box.
Exactly like the Skinner box. When you are endlessly scrolling a feed, you don't know when the next hit of validation or the next spike of moral outrage is going to appear on the screen. It might be the next swipe. It might be 5 swipes away.
You are just a rat in a box, endlessly pulling the lever, waiting for the chemical hit of dopamine or cortisol.
And this reveals the profound, almost invisible emotional tragedy of algorithmic governance. The users are caught in a massive reinforcement learning loop, but they don't realize they're the ones being trained.
Walk through how that training actually alters a person's identity over time. Because this is the subtle part.
Okay, think about a normal person posting on a platform. They post a nuanced, moderate opinion. It gets almost zero engagement. The algorithm buries it because it doesn't trigger high arousal.
Right, crickets.
A week later, that same person is feeling frustrated, so they post something slightly more controversial, slightly more angry. Suddenly, their phone lights up. A rush of likes, retweets, angry comments from opponents, supportive comments from allies.
The algorithm rewards them with massive visibility. They feel seen. They feel important.
The dopamine hits, so the next time they post, they unconsciously tailor their language to be a little sharper, a little more extreme. They think they are simply expressing their authentic political or social identity.
But the truth is, the algorithm is systematically training them.
It is slowly, imperceptibly conditioning them to become a more extreme, more outraged, less empathetic version of themselves, simply to maintain their social standing within the digital pack.
It's horrifying. The realization that your own moral outrage, the political anger you feel deep in your chest, might not even be fully your own. It is a programmed, conditioned response to a variable reward schedule engineered by a machine optimizing for ad revenue.
You are adapting your personality to please an algorithm.
Now escalate that. If private tech corporations are deploying these psychological techniques merely to maximize downstream engagement and quarterly profit, what happens when military and state intelligence actors take control of these exact same tools to achieve geopolitical power?
Then we enter the theater of cognitive warfare.
This is where we dive into the declassified NATO material, the NATO Chief Scientist Report on Cognitive Warfare 2026.
Reading this report is where the synthesis of everything we've discussed crystallizes into explicit military doctrine. It is no longer theoretical psychology, it is applied warfare.
The NATO report explicitly states that the global battle space has fundamentally shifted. For centuries, warfare was confined to land, sea, air, then space, and eventually cyber.
But the report defines the sixth domain of warfare as the human mind itself.
And they break this new domain down into 3 distinct levels of attack. First, the biological level, using emerging neuroscience and biotechnology to physically manipulate the arousal states, fatigue, and attention spans of a target population.
Second, the psychological level, utilizing artificial intelligence to tailor specific stimuli to the precise psychological vulnerabilities of individuals, which is exactly the surveillance capitalism architecture we just mapped out.
And third, the social level, utilizing the outraged, fractured population to systematically tear apart the fabric of institutional trust, turning the citizens of a nation into the very weapons that destroy it.
The tactical core of this strategy revolves around disrupting something called the ODA loop, ODA. Observe, orient, decide, act.
It's a classic concept developed by military strategist John Boyd for fighter pilots.
Right. In a dogfight, the pilot who completes the cycle of observing the environment, orienting themselves to the threat, making a decision, and executing an action, the fastest will win. If you can disrupt your enemy's ability to observe or orient, they will inevitably make a fatal decision.
Now, take that fighter pilot concept and apply it to a civilian population scrolling on their smartphones. If I am a hostile state actor conducting cognitive warfare against a rival nation, I do not need to risk dropping a kinetic bomb on a power grid.
I just need to systematically corrupt the observe and orient phases of your citizens' OODA loops.
If I flood your media ecosystem with a fire hose of multi-channel falsehoods,
If I trigger your population's amygdalas with high-arousal fear imagery,
if I trap your voters in algorithmic outrage loops that constantly reward extremism,
your internal map of the world is completely irreparably broken. You are observing a hyper-real simulation of threats that don't exist while ignoring the ones that do.
and if you orient yourself based on a broken map, you will inevitably make the wrong decision.
Every single time. You will vote for destructive policies, you will attack your neighbors, you will refuse vital public health measures, you will dismantle your own democracy. And the state actor didn't have to fire a single bullet.
I have to highlight the math presented in this NATO report, because seeing human perception reduced to an algebraic formula is staggering.
It is wild.
They literally calculate the efficacy of reality manipulation using an equation. The probability of manipulation equals the volume of information multiplied by its emotional valency, divided by cognitive resilience, multiplied by institutional trust.
So P equals volume times emotion divided by resilience times trust.
If you look at the variables in that formula, if you maximize the volume of the fire hose and you maximize the emotional valency using the outrage economy, the top half of the fraction approaches infinity.
And at the exact same time, you are actively degrading the bottom half of the fraction. You attack public cognitive resilience with exhaustion, and you shatter institutional trust in journalism, science, and the judiciary.
The math dictates the outcome. The probability of manipulating the entire population approaches 100%. It is a mathematical certainty.
If we look back through history, there is a chilling parallel that proves how effective this can be. This isn't the first time states have intentionally manipulated the perceived reality of a population to maintain control. Look at Operation Gladio in Europe during the Cold War.
The strategy of tension.
Exactly. State-sponsored clandestine intelligence groups were orchestrating horrific terror attacks, sometimes directly against their own innocent civilian populations. Bombings at train stations, assassinations.
The strategy was to keep the population in a constant, paralyzing state of fear and tension.
The goal was to manipulate the public into demanding authoritarian security measures and rejecting political alternatives out of a desperate need for safety. They used physical, kinetic violence and false flag operations to manufacture a specific political reality.
If states and intelligence agencies were willing to murder their own citizens to create a reality, then it is breathtakingly naive to assume they wouldn't use epistemic chaos, algorithmic manipulation, and cognitive warfare to achieve the exact same geopolitical goals today.
The tools are just cleaner now.
That is the most disturbing realization of this entire deep dive. We are talking about military-grade psychological operations, weapons of mass cognitive disruption, and they are being deployed against civilians through the brightly colored social media apps on their phones.
We think we are just checking our feeds. We think we are just catching up on the news or watching a funny video. But we are active combatants in a global cognitive war, taking heavy incoming fire, and we don't even recognize that we are on the battlefield.
Which brings us to the terminal point of this entire system. The ultimate destination when you merge biological fear, algorithmic surveillance, and cognitive warfare. Objective reality simply ceases to exist.
We enter the simulacrum.
Sitting in the middle of our stack of sources is Jean Baudrillard's 1981 philosophical masterwork, Simulacra and Simulation. It is notoriously dense, incredibly abstract, but when you read it in the context of algorithms and AI, it reads less like philosophy and more like the exact engineering blueprint of what we are living through right this second.
Baudrillard argued that advanced consumer societies have replaced all profound reality and meaning with symbols and signs. The representation of the thing becomes more important than the thing itself, and he outlined 4 distinct stages of how the sign order gradually murders reality.
Understanding this progression is crucial. Stage 1. The sign is a faithful copy of reality. It reflects a profound physical truth. Think of a beautifully detailed portrait painting or a highly accurate map.
Right. It is a representation, but it points directly to something real.
Stage 2. The sign perverts and distorts reality. It masks reality as an evil appearance. Think of a propagandistic photograph. It captures a real event, but the lighting, the angle, the framing are manipulated to tell a lie about what actually happened.
Stage 3. The sign masks the absence of a profound reality. It pretends to be a copy, but there is no original. Baudrillard uses Disneyland as the perfect example.
Disneyland presents itself as an imaginary place to make us believe that the rest of Los Angeles is real, when in fact, the entire surrounding culture is completely artificial.
And then the terminal phase, stage 4.
The pure simulacrum. The sign has absolutely no relationship to any reality whatsoever. It is its own pure simulacrum. Signs just reflect other signs in an endless loop of artificiality.
Think of an AI-generated influencer on social media, living a generated lifestyle, interacting with bot accounts, generating real ad revenue, shaping real human desires, but possessing absolutely zero connection to physical existence.
To illustrate the terrifying totality of this final stage, Baudrillard borrows a fable from the writer Jorge Luis Borges. It is a story about an ancient, massive empire whose cartographers became obsessed with exactitude.
They wanted to build the perfect map.
They built a map of the empire so absurdly detailed, so massive, that it literally covered the entire physical territory of the empire itself, mile for mile. A one-to-one scale map resting directly on top of the Earth.
But as time goes on, the physical empire begins to crumble. The Earth decays, the cities turn to dust, the physical world rots away.
But the map remains. It is pristine. And future generations born onto this massive parchment end up living on the map. They mistake the cartography for the real world. They forget the Earth ever existed beneath it.
As Baudrillard writes, the map precedes the territory.
The map precedes the territory. Now, connect that ancient fable to the architecture of surveillance, capitalism, and cognitive warfare we just mapped out. The digital algorithm is the map. Your data shadow, your psychographic profile, your calculated risk score, your engagement metrics, that is the map of your life.
And society now treats that digital map as fundamentally more real than your actual physical self. If the Clearview AI algorithm prints out a risk score that says Robert Williams is a criminal, the police believe the algorithm.
They look at the physical man standing in front of them, the territory, and they reject it in favor of the map. The map overrides the territory.
We are living inside what Baudrillard called a perfect descriptive machine. Truth, objective physical truth, has been entirely replaced by processing fluency and algorithmic engagement metrics.
If a falsehood trends globally, it creates real-world geopolitical consequences. It becomes true. If the algorithm surfaces it, it is our reality. The territory, our shared physical human reality, is rotting away beneath the crushing weight of the digital map.
It is the literal death of reality.
Okay, let's synthesize this journey we've just been on.
We have traced the complete architecture of modern cognitive control.
We started by looking at how state-sponsored fear tactics biologically hijack your amygdala, utilizing the democratization of risk to soften the target and induce traumatic bonding. We looked at how the firehose of repetition exploits your brain's processing fluency to install absolute falsehoods using the illusory truth effect.
We explored how the extractive engine of surveillance capitalism mines your data exhaust to create a psychographic voodoo doll of your deepest vulnerabilities.
We saw how algorithmic governance traps you in an outrage economy, using variable reinforcement schedules to train you like a lab rat, optimizing your anger for downstream engagement. We looked at how NATO recognizes this exact digital ecosystem as the sixth domain of cognitive warfare, where hostile actors disrupt your OD loop to destroy society from within.
Culminating in Baudrillard's pure simulacrum, where the simulation is the only thing that matters and the map permanently replaces the territory.
It is a staggering amount of information to process. But as we close this out, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on all of these sources, but takes the implication one step further.
An extrapolation of the trajectory we are on.
We've spent this time discussing how these algorithmic systems create a bespoke, custom-built reality for every single individual, a digital feed designed specifically to trigger your unique, highly personal psychological vulnerabilities. But if that is true, if my reality feed is fundamentally, mathematically different from your reality feed, what happens to the concept of a shared human history?
It creates a profound epistemological loneliness.
Think about it. Can a society, or a functioning democracy, or even just a local community, actually survive when no two citizens are living in the same reality? When there is absolutely no shared baseline of objective truth to even begin a debate? If we don't share a reality today, how can we possibly share a future tomorrow?
The documents we've analyzed aren't just academic papers, they are the source code for the map we are all currently living on.
Next time you pick up your phone and start scrolling, next time you feel that sudden high arousal surge of moral outrage or fear, stop and ask yourself, are you reacting to the territory or are you just following the map? Always question the map.
It's the only way to find the territory again.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.